Hello and welcome to our UKLA Conversation series. My name is Navan Govender. I'm from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And today I'm talking to Sabine Little about how, as higher education tutors and lecturers, we're making the move to online teaching and learning. So hello, Sabine. Do you want to maybe just introduce yourself a little?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sabine Little. I'm a lecturer in languages education at the University of Sheffield, and there I also direct the International Postgraduate Certificate in Education. So we've got about 70 students who are all learning how to be teachers online. So the programme has always been online. And the reason we're chatting today really is because we got talking couple of weeks ago or so, and I actually, for the UKLA, convened the Literacy and Multilingualism Special Interest Group. But we were starting to talk about teaching online, and I've been working online since the early 2000s, really. So I've been directing online distance programs for a long time, and at some point I was working for one of the Centres for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, enhancing technology-enhanced learning across the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So I've done a fair bit of online distance learning, and while there's always more to learn, we thought that maybe getting together today might be a good idea to explore some of our different contexts and some ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. It's I think there's such a broad range of expertise and experience out there, you know, so some of us are engaging with this or making this move for the first time, or the move is more extensive, you know, and so the varying range of skills available and experiences is probably what we want to talk about, which is why I think it's brilliant that that you'll get to speak, because I think there's a lot of what you do that will now start becoming perhaps a little more mainstream. And so your expertise would be brilliant. So what we've done is we've collated some of the questions that we received from other UKLA members. And the first kind of question that we got, or set of questions, revolved around interaction. And, you know, so how do you use these online platforms, whether it's Teams or Zoom or whatever it is, to get some kind of interaction and conversation going, especially with large groups, that you might have only been able to get in a face-to-face setting?
Yeah, I think that can be really tricky, because when you think about it, we all know that life of university isn't just sitting in a classroom and being taught. There is the social aspect of being able to grab a peer and going off for a cup of coffee or something. And yeah, there is a lot of peer-to-peer, peer-to-tutor interaction, and then there's kind of the whole cohort all together that has this community feel, this sense of identity, and it can be quite tricky, but not impossible, to try and replicate that in an online context. So I do try to think of it literally as trying to facilitate that tutor to student communication. That's fairly straightforward, and then the cohort as a whole, where you create this sense of identity and where you create opportunities for everybody to contribute to ideas, take things forward, maybe have discussions, for example, but also opportunities for the students to hang out unobserved, for want of a better word, to try and grab that virtual coffee, to create spaces where it is possible to just pose a question like, what did you have for tea? Or, you know, just things that you would have in a face-to-face context or in a campus-based context. And I think not overlooking those in a virtual platform is really important.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's you know, so some of these concerns are about whether or not these online platforms only allow one person to speak at a time, and especially in large groups. How do you manage giving students the space to speak to each other and then to speak back to whole class scenarios? So do you have any ideas about managing that and what that might look like?
Yeah, I think it very much depends on what you're trying to do at any one time. So for example, are you trying to set up a space that is very fleeting. You know, are you trying to set up a space for a seminar where everybody chats to each other and then afterwards it's gone? Are you trying to create an actual environment that is maintained and that has opportunities for synchronous and asynchronous communication for an extended period of time, and allowing students even 2 months later to come back and go, oh, that's what I contributed to that, and actually now I want to draw on that for my assignment, or you know, those. So I think those are two different ways of looking at what technology has to offer us. And similarly, synchronous and asynchronous offers some opportunities for managing numbers. So asynchronous communication is much more manageable with a larger cohort, because you know the conversation sort of drips forward. Whereas if you've got 80 people in an online seminar and they're all trying to say something at the same time, then you would probably end up breaking people into smaller subgroups to try and keep that manageable. And we have about 70 plus students in maybe 36, 37 countries. They're all in different time zones. For that reason, all my teaching is, almost all, is asynchronous, because every time I try, it doesn't matter whether I pick 4 AM UK time or 2 PM UK, I'm always disadvantaging somebody. So maybe the idea is to ask a question and give students 36 hours, however long you want, to respond on an online discussion board, and discuss with them, share with them what you think is a valuable discussion post. This is something that I deal a lot with. You know, in a discussion that actually moves forward, you don't go, agreed. You know, it's not quite the same as you might post on, you know, on a mate's Facebook page, for example. Yeah. So some of the things that we've talked about is that, you know, in a valuable discussion point, you know, you would try to bring the discussion forward, would try to respond to what somebody else said in front of you, rather than just adding your 2 pennies worth without acknowledging any work that anybody else has done. You might draw on your personal or professional experience. You might bring in something that you've read. So by the time you think about all of that, it'll be highly unlikely that it'll be, you know, a 20-word response. And on the program that I direct, people really, that's where the teaching takes place. So they take the time to really engage with those posts. And some of them, we're about to start a blog, because some of them are like 500 words long. And the reason we're starting a blog to capture that kind of learning is because every summer I go in and I scrub all the discussion boards, and I felt really guilty because I felt like I was destroying a lot of labour that students have put in. So we were looking for an alternative output. So shifting stuff around from the synchronous to the asynchronous, from real-time input to something that might be more film focused, and then thinking about where to create these spaces for peer interaction, so that the seminars are not, even though you might have 20 students in the room, ultimately they are turning up thinking that they are there to engage with you. No, so but in a more workshop kind of scenario, if you create opportunities for them to talk to each other, so you might set a reflective task and you're there, but ultimately you're stepping back and you're seeing, you know, them with their ideas, or even hand over leadership and say, okay, you know, on a Friday afternoon or whenever, you're going to take it in turns, and each one of you is going to reflect on, you know, something that you've read, or, you know, just creating more opportunities for that peer-to-peer interaction and expertise development, I guess.
Yeah. So, and because I think that opens up. It sounds like it's really opening up a range of different spaces and possibilities. Like I said, you know, often maybe if we're not comfortable, not familiar with some of the software that we're using, we're limited by what we think the software itself does and allows us to do. So, you know, if we're moving and if we're planning for interactions across, you know, students maybe working on their own in their homes, in small groups, in seminars, in lecture kind of Zoom meetings, I think like the combination, the various combinations of those is probably what may enable or disenable certain kinds of community building and interactions, right?
Yeah, hopefully. And I think the thing to remember is that the students that we are teaching on teacher training, of course, they will have a very different placement experience as well, you know, going into school. So for some of them, they will find themselves in a position of actually having to teach online or to first shadow a class online or whatever. So I think that is potentially a very real possibility for next year. So thinking about that and building that into their learning experience, that they have a chance to manage those interactions rather than just participating in them, but actually actively being responsible for making them work, I think will then ultimately also help with any PGCE or PGDE learning outcomes as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. I think, you know, what schooling will look like from now on is also about, is also changing. And so thinking about how different technologies and our abilities to use them help us think about teaching and learning, not only in higher education, but help us to think about it at school level, is also really useful. So, you know, one of the things that I know came up in relation to that is around, you know, providing learners or even students with access to resources, so access to webinars, and, you know, a lot of us maybe generating content and just putting it out there, and not necessarily scaffolding how students are meant to interact with it and where they're meant to start, what they're supposed to do before, during, and after engaging with, say, a webinar, for example. Do you think that there's any advice that you could give for us that would help us think about what do those instructions look like, and what are the various forms that we can provide input so that we can work across these asynchronous and synchronous platforms?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and a really important question, because you're absolutely right. I think now there are more resources available or have been made available in the last 3 months than there have ever been, and you can take your pick from the number of celebrities you want to do story night, and you know, so the sheer and the number of authors who have come together and created resources, for example, to be used in teaching is absolutely phenomenal. So in engaging, I guess there's, again, we've talked about this in preparing for this today, that it's a bit meta when we're thinking about how do we teach the teacher trainees, but at the same time, through that, we are looking at resources aimed at the children, ultimately, the end learner. So how do we facilitate teacher trainees to engage with pedagogical resources, but also how do we enable them to make the best out of the resources available for children, either still during the COVID crisis or going forward, because those resources hopefully won't go away and will still be available. So I think those are two slightly different points. I think with most pedagogical resources, they come with some sort of learning outcomes, or, you know, at least a sort of mission statement of, like us two, we're talking together, you know, for specific purposes. So hopefully that is slightly more covered, shall I say. And I've certainly found that my students have been quite capable of watching different resources and taking away what they felt was useful to them. Although bearing in mind, we are now at the end of the academic year rather than at the beginning of the academic year. So that might need some additional scaffolding. So, but that might just need a tutor saying, you know, here's a resource I thought you might find useful. I particularly enjoyed finding out about this, and here is how it ties to the program. That kind of thing is, I think, fairly easily done. In terms of creativity of actually using the various resources that are around, that obviously depends on what kind of teacher training program is. So for what sector, for example, and I think that would potentially need either tutor input in terms of here's an idea of what you might do with this, or a specific task. Here is a resource. As a group or individual, go away for 2 hours, think about what you might do with a class of 6-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 14-year-olds, whatever the resource is, and then come back and share it. And then through that sharing, build up the expertise and the flexibility of working with these kinds of resources.
Yeah. How easily manageable do you think it is to do something like that with, say, larger groups? So I know, like for myself with the PGDE English, we can get anywhere between 65 and 90 students in a single cohort. And although there are 2 of us working on the program, we're still quite used to working with those large groups in the kind of large workshop and seminar type settings. Yeah, do you have any ideas of how we might be able to manage something like that?
I think something as interactive as that will be difficult. I'm plucking a number out of thin air, but I would say with anything bigger than 15, you're going to start struggling, because even, you know, but having said that, as a tutor, you don't have to be everywhere at once. So if you set up breakout rooms, that doesn't mean that you have to stick with one particular group. You know, imagine in any classroom, you've got your larger number of kids, but you would walk around if they're doing any work to check on them individually. In the same way, you can pop in and out of, you know, subgroups that you're setting up on Zoom, for example. Just check, you know, hang in there for 10 minutes, maybe give a bit of input, and then drop over to the next one. And you could, for example, then ask each group, if you're using, you know, any of the many whiteboard programs, for example, you could ask them to summarize key ideas to share with the wider group at large and make those available. Just even if somebody's taking notes and they take a screenshot of it, you know, there's so many different opportunities. Or they can record part of their conversation and as part of the task prepare a short presentation on ideas that they have, and then you can edit them all together, you know, into a short video, just by not by creating an Oscar-worthy masterpiece, but literally just shoving them together into a single unit. You know, if every group comes up with a 5-minute presentation, and you've got 4 groups of 15, then that gives 20 minutes worth of resource to share with the entire group afterwards. And hopefully the students will then see that their thinking and their efforts are being fed back to the group at large. So it's not as though it's a task that they engage with and then they go off and do their own thing, but actually it's valued in such a way that something is coming out of it to be shared with the group.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think just as you're speaking, I'm imagining how our students could break out into their rooms, almost do like little micro teaching sessions, you know, and kind of teach each other a topic, you know, whether it's pitched at high school level or if it's pitched at a kind of a teacher education level, and then if they recorded that or created, it resulted in some kind of text being produced that could be uploaded to like our internal online learning system, and there could be a process where all the groups can then go and watch or access 2 or 3 other groups' work, and provide comments and kind of engage that way. Yeah, I mean, some of this also opens up, I think, the possibilities for rethinking the kinds of texts that students produce. You know, so I think we're very used to students maybe producing, on one side, you know, assessment kind of tasks where it's essays and presentations and things that they submit for their own education. But if they're also submitting drafts of the kinds of activities and texts that they want to use in their own classrooms, should some of those texts include, you know, audio, text, videos, other kinds of PowerPoints or different kinds of presentation styles or formats and things like that. Yeah, I think that starts to really open up what's possible, and again, the kinds of text that make it into a classroom, because more and more we're hopefully starting to see that this broad range of texts and ways of communicating are becoming more and more relevant and then pertinent for survival.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think the way in which teaching, well, maybe the way in which learning works is changing. My son is downstairs right now. Well, no, right now he's doing history or something. But earlier over lunchtime, he ended up watching old rough science videos, which those of a certain age will remember was an Open University program where they dumped scientists in a remote location, and through their scientific wit, they had to survive and find scientific solutions to random things. And he does that in his spare time. So the way children learn is becoming much more media linked in a certain way. And I think schools do that as well. There is an awful lot of media linked and related education. I'm not advocating that everything has to happen in front of a screen, but I think overarchingly we can, as a profession, get more creative with the way we think about learning and teaching. And again, there's nothing wrong with then taking it one step further and taking it into the school classroom, and students doing a narrated PowerPoint or whatever it is. And if every student does one slide with a book on it, and here are the book recommendations of class 4C or whatever, and you edit them all together, and you've got something that you can share with the head of school or with parents. All of these kinds of things make the link between everybody. If you've got something you can email to parents and say, just watch what your kids did, just much more connected overall.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I mean, hopefully in the future we'll pick up on that, the other side of that conversation. You raised that this is, is this a question of how we engage with students, and then how do we engage with students as teachers moving into classrooms? So hopefully at some point we'll be able to tackle that kind of second question of stepping closer and closer into classroom practice. But I think this has been really interesting and really revealing about the possibilities of what teacher education could look like, and how we navigate all of these kind of online and real spaces. I was wondering, I know you showed it to me the last time, and kind of going back to that question of space, if you could talk through that resource for on classroom spaces, and this just kind of picks up on that question that we received about virtual reality and whether or not that technology is relevant for our discussion and for higher ITE providers.
Yeah, definitely. So in preparing and in reading the questions, there was the question about virtual reality. Now, I mean, virtual reality would argue that the person is in the space and is moving through the space. That is slightly different and requires slightly different technology, in terms of goggles, etc. But what I think is really useful is virtual tours, and I've actually done a bit more prep since we chatted about this yesterday. So if it's all right for me to share my screen and just do a bit of walking through, shall we give that a go?
Sure.
Right, fingers crossed. So, I want to share a resource that colleagues did, first of all, in the School of Education of Broomhall Nursery School in Sheffield. And they went in with 360-degree cameras to put together this space analysis. So just like a Google map, essentially, you can click on different spaces and then do this 360-degree overview of where you are. And I've just snooked myself because I wanted to get to the library at the far end, but I've got something else to show you. But yeah, so this is one example where students without having to necessarily visit a space, because I think that will potentially be difficult, or certainly reduced in terms of how many different spaces a student might be able to access. But there are a number of these resources available. I'm just going to share another one. No, wait. There. So this is what I was quite surprised actually. All I did was I ran a search on 360 virtual tours primary school. And these are just some of the results that came up. Now this one I found interesting because it's got children in it. I'm assuming this is an official primary school's website. So I'm assuming they've got the appropriate permissions for this. But this, for example, would be great to do an analysis of, how is this classroom set up, who is doing what, at what tables, what kind of learning stations are set up, what can you see on the walls. So this is just one of the many ways in which, there's a reading corner, and I'm going to see if I can get this last one to work. There, this is the library of another primary school. So again, you can have a more detailed look around and see how it's set up in terms of, technology, in terms of shelving. It takes a bit of navigating, this one in particular, but just working out how you can then compare different learning spaces, for example. And if you start searching, once you start, for my program, for the IPGCE, I'm quite keen that my students get a chance to compare international educational contexts. So I found a school in Taiwan, for example, that the students can look at. And for me, that is really, really important. And either way, my students, COVID or no COVID, won't be able to travel around the world and look at varying educational contexts. So hopefully, again, this is something many schools themselves have got this on their sites. Many schools have put it together due to COVID, instead of being able to run open days for incoming pupils. So actually, again, this is something where over the last few months, a lot has been done and a lot of additional resources been created. So using that creatively, hopefully, will be one way of using technology to make it a bit easier for students to compare different learning spaces and learn from that kind of setup.
Well, I think that's brilliant. The idea of gaining access to these spaces so that student teachers can analyze them and think seriously about how these learning spaces are constructed. And especially across different contexts, so how different classrooms represent different subject areas or disciplines, how they represent different teachers and teaching styles, how they represent different countries and contexts and stuff like that. I think that sounds fantastic. It also kind of raises the possibility of student teachers perhaps redesigning those classroom spaces in the face of their own contexts and concerns, and in terms of COVID, how rethinking what those spaces might look like. I know already on Twitter, in-service teachers have been, returning back to schools and, arranging their classrooms and using kind of national and other guidance to rethink their classrooms already. And so they've been posting pictures about showing what their classrooms look like now. And so this is, again, just another way of accessing some of those ideas and really interrogating what classroom environments can and should or might look like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially what becomes very obvious in that first resource that I shared that colleagues from the School of Education did, I mean, that's an early years context, and that's set up for continuous provision where teachers plan for possible lines of learning, child initiated play, etc. When you take COVID into account and the removal of anything that might potentially carry COVID, you're not left with a whole lot of stuff for children to get engaged with. So I totally understand teachers and early years providers' frustration with having to comply with this. And I think, you know, who knows, maybe ultimately this will be maybe somebody will do a before and after of a 360 resource to research, you know, what's happening and what that ultimately means to how our children are able to engage in play and learning. I think that might go beyond the scope of this session, this meeting, but I think, yeah, I think exploring space to a certain extent, yes, obviously all the spaces that I've just shared are spaces how they were, which might be very different to spaces how they will be in the coming academic year, at least for a while.
Yeah, yeah, of course, but yeah, at least this you've given us some ideas about how to start asking those questions and introducing again just this range of resources that many may have stumbled upon or know about, and that many of, I know, like myself included, just didn't know about, or would not have even thought of. So I think, yeah, having some idea about what's out there, and then getting, like, using some guidance to think about, well, what kinds of decisions can I make in the new academic year on how students can see themselves as part of the university, as part of the School of Education, as part of a particular cohort, as engaged and not just kind of constantly on the receiving end of all this information. I think you've really raised some really interesting ideas and possibilities. There's maybe one last kind of area that I think we could talk about kind of explicitly. I think it's come up in the discussion, but it's around feedback. And the possibilities for gaining feedback. You know, so you spoke at one point. You spoke a little bit about, you know, students presenting to each other and that kind of thing. But and it made me think of the chat function. Again, my imagination is sometimes limited to Zoom and what Zoom looks like. But I know we've been encouraged to use the chat function, you know, during lectures and during seminars to help increase engagement and interaction. And I thought, you know, that's a possibility for getting some kind of feedback. Because I know you can download the chat after the session as well. But what do you think, that there are any other possibilities, or?
Yeah, I think there are loads. I mean, I think ultimately any of this is slightly easier if there is a permanent home. Now, if everything is on Zoom, then it's very fleeting because you've got your individual sessions, and then when they're gone, they're gone. So if there is anything like an online learning environment, we've got Blackboard, for example, but obviously whether you run it, you know, on Google, for, you know, to all intents and purposes, you could set up a Google Drive for your students. But the idea that you have a space where if work is shared or if effort is made, it doesn't disappear at the end of a scheduled session. I think that can be quite important, because that then allows you to, it allows you to prepare in advance, which I think is really important, so that you don't feel that as soon as the academic year starts, you're in this constant frenzy of having to sort out the next session. So to have a space that you can start building up over the summer, if at all possible, and decide, okay, I'm gonna do a film about this, that's where it's gonna live, and then the students are gonna do that, and chart the learning pathway. I'm gonna watch the film, and they're gonna do that activity, then they're gonna share it on that discussion board. You know, that sort of outline. But I do think getting feedback right from the start is really important, and I think it's really important to build that kind of culture into the program design. So literally the very first task that my students do is it's a Padlet, which, if people haven't come across, is like, it's like a bunch of sticky notes, virtual sticky notes essentially. And I ask my students, I put a Padlet on and it's embedded into Blackboard, but you can run it independently. It just lives there on the internet. So the students get a link and it's like you start a new sticky note, essentially. And I asked students about their hopes and dreams and fears. So hopes, dreams and fears linked to the programme. Now, again, bearing in mind that my students are all over the world. So some of them have got quite, so some of them have been teaching for years, some of them are absolutely new. Almost everybody thinks they must be the least pedagogically educated person on the entire programme. So that, again, this idea of getting feedback right from the start, what are you hoping to get out of this programme? It allows me to engage actively by responding to those comments, adding to discussion posts and saying, okay, I can see that there is a fear around lesson planning, which for us is the first assignment that they have to do. So I go, okay, well, we've got some self-access resources for you, and Unit 4, you will find that there's some great resources there for you to work with. So it allows immediately this dialogue. And we have on our programme something that I call a reflective nudge. So once a week, I will post something. And it might be something from current affairs. It might be an article, a newspaper article that came out from anywhere around the world, because my students are global. Or it might be something that we've pre-prepared. There are certain times of year where we know students will struggle with how to construct a question, for example. And we post that on a discussion board, and for that week, that's what the students are engaging in. And last year, it got to the point around about November time where there just wasn't a lot of traffic on these discussion boards. So one week's reflective nudge was me going, look, people, you're not engaging with these. What's going on? Are they the wrong nudges? What do you want? Obviously phrased slightly more polite, but it was a genuine, I was flummoxed. I've taught this programme for 5 years. And every year we've had more and more students and more interaction. And last year was just a bit more quiet than other years. So by the time we got round to November, I said, look, what is it you want? We can do it. Just let us know. And the students just fessed up and said, look, they're great, but we're just so busy. So, okay, look, you don't have to engage every week, but try and think, okay, every other week or whatever, I'm gonna look and I'm gonna do something. So I think it's about getting to the point where that dialogue feels natural. And that is something that happens very naturally in a face-to-face, or rather, I should say, in a campus-based learning environment, because a student might stay behind for a bit to chat to you, or they might see you, I don't know, sorting through your papers, or, it's just a bit more human, shall I say. So again, something that I do with my students, and I thought they must think I'm just, in silly syndrome. I do this thing, I do it with all my students. I saw this and thought of you. So I will send out announcements and I say, I came across this webinar. It's got nothing to do with a core program, but I just think you find it interesting. It's free, that's when it's happening. Or, oh, I just read this article, which I really like. I just throw it at them. And they love it. They absolutely love it, because it makes everything, they notice that you care. And it is genuinely, I'm looking at it and it is, I saw this and thought of you. That's exactly what it is. I read something and I go, oh, I think you have to use this. So anything like that helps to create those kinds of links so that they still feel that they are part of something, as we started out with, something real, not something that just lives in the computer, but a real community.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. It goes back to that idea of recognizing that our students and the work that we're doing works beyond that screen. So I think, especially when it comes to a lot of these online learning platforms, and if we're not used to working with them, it's perhaps easy to see how everything gets uploaded to this thing kind of in the ether, and you don't know when and how anyone else is accessing it. So the reality beyond that ether is so abstract. But being very conscious that, well, there's this is just a new medium for otherwise what would be quite a human experience, and should still be quite a human experience, will hopefully help us keep on top of engaging through the online medium. So I like that idea of, you know, constantly kind of sending out nudges or sharing information. You know, that activity, that constant activity, just means that there's a little bit more of a human element, and that it's not always a formal communication. You know, I think that barrier is sometimes, if we send out communications through our online learning space, it goes to students as an email, and it's, you know, it comes from the university, and, you know, it performs a very specific function, and it looks a very particular way. Whereas if we start to manipulate some of that communication to the kinds of communication that we have in classrooms, in between sessions, outside of classroom doors, or just as we're packing up, like all those conversations happen in reality. They don't have to stop. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, those nudges, and thinking about your students are real people on the other side of this, and they might be interested, or they're invested, and or that you need to check up on them.
Yeah, I think just you saying checking up, I think reminds me, it's the other thing is, of course they're human, and of course they've all got and will have over the coming year potentially very different experiences. I mean, I noticed that on my program, which was very different from a UK based program, because I've got students all over the world. So when COVID hit, it hit different teachers, different students, different schools at different times. So I've got teachers in China who were the first ones in January to go, whoa, and then we could literally follow the virus moving, with people saying, yep, schools have now shut in Monaco, schools have shut in Italy, you know, and one of the reflective nudges that we did, I just stopped everything and I just went, look guys, are you all right? You know, and I think again we need to make space for that, because all my student teachers essentially were all in classrooms, and they were all having to cope with moving everything online. So we just, and of course teaching online was not part of the units that I had carefully prepared for the program. So I just shoved everything out of the window and said, look, you know, let's, what kind of cool resources have you found? What are you finding helpful? What's useful? And the student, there was just like this collective gasp of relief from students. Okay, we can talk to somebody about this. So again, being conscious of that, and I'm not saying that as tutors we necessarily are in a position to provide mental health support, because obviously there are people trained in that, and I would never advocate somebody taking over a role at that sort of professional level. But in terms of creating a space where students feel able to share, you know, when they are concerned, or when they are worried, or when they are unsure about something, I think that is really important.
Okay, well, I think that's probably a useful point to wrap up. I think, yeah, the ideas that you've helped raise, and some of the questions, your responses to them, I'm sure a lot of people who watch this will gain some insight, and at least and get some ideas. But also, I think, start hopefully interrogating what we sometimes think of as like quite a fearful, scary, unknown place, and also, you know, think beyond the limitations of, so again, what the software sometimes presents, or what we think is there. There's a lot of stuff that you're talking about that seems to draw on, you know, all the principles of teaching and learning that so many of us know and do. And, you know, just because it's a new space, maybe keep reminding ourselves, don't forget that there's things that we can do that don't necessarily have to be completely new, but it's about mixing and matching all of these ideas as we go along. Yeah, so thank you very much.
No, thank
hopefully
you.
we'll have another conversation to this series.